Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the podcast Discos Memorables or Memorable Records. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you live from the great state of Tennessee, from the small town of Martin, Tennessee, right here in the northwestern corner of this beautiful state. And today we're going to have a very special edition of Discos Memorables. You can hear I'm not speaking Spanish this time. It's going to be a special edition in English about a record that is memorable to our guest and also very memorable, very much so, to myself. I'm talking about a trip back in time to 1964, to the very end of 1964, for an album by the Beatles, simply entitled Beatles for Sale. And today, our guest is my good friend and colleague from the university right here, Daniel Nappo, from the great and also mitten-shaped state of Michigan. Hello, Dan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Anton. Thank you for the introduction. It's good to be here.
I'm glad to finally have been able to do this. You and I have talked about the Beatles a whole lot. You are a Beatlemaniac as much as I am, and so it's always nice to have some time, take some time off work to chat a little bit about the Beatles. And the album that you've chosen, Beatles for Sale, in my opinion, and also in your opinion, is a great album. Not everyone agrees with that. There are several critics that criticize the album pretty harshly. But to you, it's a memorable record. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? Why do you think this is a memorable record by the Beatles?
Well, I agree with your assessment of it. A lot of people don't think it's a great album, but even the worst album by the Beatles is better than the best album by a lot of other groups and artists. And I listened to it in my car last week. I was driving to Jackson. I put it in. I saw it laying around, and it sort of struck me as sort of an embryonic rubber soul. And, the cover shows him kind of, despondent in some ways. And the title almost seems overtly, sarcastically commercial. And then I started listening to the songs, and the first three, No Reply, I'm a Loser, Babies in Black. Here were these guys that just made this wonderful comedy that was the cinematic event of the summer of 1964, had everybody laughing. And then they come out with this album where they're looking all dour and they're singing about women abandoning them and being a loser. And I was just really struck by that. And as I listened to the rest of the album, I found little things I liked about every single song, even Mr. Moonlight. I think the album deserves a re-listening by a lot of the people who don't like it. At the very least, we could say it's probably the most unknown of the Beatles albums, but in terms of what they've done, I think it's as great as just about anything else they've done.
Definitely, it's one of the most obscure, although it has some really good songs, as you mentioned. Now, your history with the Beatles goes way back. Can you tell us a little bit about your first memories of listening to the Beatles?
Well, like a lot of people my age, we were born in the late 60s, my musical education started with the Beatles, and I owe all the thanks to my mother for that. She was a huge Beatles fan. In fact, my middle name is named after her favorite Beatle, John. I never had this album, though. We had an album called Beatles 65, which was the U.S. version of some of these songs with some different ones thrown in. I only came around to this album later when I saw the British original releases of their LPs. I've always loved the Beatles. I can never make up my mind what phase of their career I like better, whether it's the late Abbey Road period or the early Please Please Me period or the psychedelic period. I don't know. My favorite album is probably Revolver by the Beatles. But this one, I think, deserves some credit, and I would put it in my top 10 by the Beatles, surely.
Well, I'm just a little bit younger, than you are, but my musical
You're a lot
education.
younger
Well,
than me.
not really, Bod. We're not going to go into that. But I feel older every day, so I guess that happens to pretty much everybody. But one thing I would say is we do share that our musical education began with the Beatles. It was the same thing with me. My father is a huge record collector, and the Beatles have always been one of the most important groups, one of the most important types of music that he has enjoyed listening to over the years. And I remember that the very first record by the Beatles I ever heard was not Beatles for Sale, but Hard Day's Night, and was hooked, from then on. And there was a time in my life when I was probably, 10, 11, when all I was listening to was the Beatles. So, definitely it's not a bad place to start a musical
No,
education.
I want to do the same thing with my children.
Now, 1964 was a very important year for the Beatles for many reasons. They had become incredibly popular all over Europe in '63, in Britain particularly. But in 1964, they finally break into the American market. Right? That really changed in many ways the outlook that the Beatles had about fame, about their music, about their role as pop stars. And really, one of the things that I think is interesting is the fact that this album, Beatles for Sale, is sandwiched in between two soundtracks. You know, the wonderful Richard Lester movie, Hard Day's Night, and then the next album after Beatles for Sale is Help. So, would you see this album as some sort of transition phase in the Beatles canon, or what do you think about that?
I do think it's a transitional album for them. I think when you look at the album, you see a greater seriousness, not just being lovable lads from Liverpool making everybody dance and laugh. There's some seriousness on this album. It also shows them as really good students of American popular music, whether it be country, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, rhythm and blues with Hey Hey Hey, Kansas City. Also, you see the beginning of some experimentation. I mean, these guys were so talented, even when they were forced into a studio after an exhausting year, a highly successful, exhausting year. They still found creativity. They just didn't want to, press something and send it off in time for Christmas. They try some different things here. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. I don't think the Hammond organ is particularly memorable on Mr. Moonlight. On the other hand, you hear this fine single of theirs, 8 Days a Week. It has a fade in, which apparently had never been done before. You even have Ringo, as I wrote about the other day. Ringo sort of is the unofficial pioneer of country rock before Graham Parsons, 3 years later, did it more consciously with his album. So there's a lot of different things here. I don't think the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. I don't think they could help but do something, a landmark in some way, big or small.
And Ringo was always a big fan of country music anyway. In fact, later on, the kinds of songs that he liked to sing the most were country songs. And Don't Pass Me By, its own composition sounds very country to me. Not to mention that in his solo career, he had that album, Beaucoup of Blues, that was recorded just down the road in Nashville. So obviously, I think you have a point right there. And you were mentioning that you wrote about this album the other day, and it was actually that post that gave me the idea of talking to you about maybe sitting down today and talking about this album, because I could see that, unlike what many people say, this album is memorable to you, and it has always been a memorable album to me. I think what you mentioned about the covers is very important. The Beatles began as a covers band, and if you look at the first two albums, at least European albums, Please Please Me and with the Beatles, there were a lot of covers in there, right, interspersed with their own compositions. And I have a feeling that after they wrote all those songs for A Hard Day's Night, they needed to put out another album, and they thought that going back to that mixture of originals and covers would have been a good idea. In some cases, I feel like Beatles for Sale is another good example of what the Beatles sounded like as a live band, but in the studio.
That's an excellent point.
And I think that's what they were going for in Please Please Me, and possibly with the Beatles as well. But now they're going back to this idea, and maybe because they needed to. Apparently they didn't have a lot of new material that they had written.
That seemed to be the major issue, why there are only apparently 8 of the 14 songs were written by Lennon and McCartney. I think in the beginning they were sort of nascent songwriters. They were learning their trade. But even though there's only 8 songs on here by the Beatles, they're really great songs. And a lot of them you could put on a later album and you wouldn't suspect they were from an earlier album. For example, Every Little Thing and What You're Doing. Those two songs to me sound like they could come right off of Rubber Soul. I'm a Loser is another one. It sounds like sort of John's work that he would do on Rubber Soul or even Revolver. So even though not all the songs are written by Lennon and McCartney, I'll Follow the Sun is another one of Paul's best songs. Even though they're not all by Lennon and McCartney, I think what they did put on the album is some of their best stuff. So even if they didn't have enough time to compose more material, what they did compose was great.
That's perhaps what I was trying to get at when I was thinking about the a phase of transition, simply because it is true that some of these songs sound like they're pointing towards
Right.
some things that are to come in their career. And I think I'm a Loser is a very good example of that. And once we start going song by song, we could talk about maybe the influence of Bob Dylan on a song like that, simply, because John was very interested in the music of Bob Dylan at this time, and so was George. So I think the album is very diverse in many ways, because it's not just an album that has one kind of song, from song number 1 to song number 14. They're really trying different things on this album, rock and roll and country, and their own compositions in different veins. But at the same time, one of the things that has always struck me as interesting about this album is there are no girl group songs on this album. Whereas in previous albums, they did have songs like "Baby It's You," for example, and then several others. Chains, yeah. All of that is absent from this album, which, in my opinion, is somewhat surprising, because I have the feeling that the girl group songs were perfect for the Beatles because of their harmonies.
Mm-hmm.
The way they harmonized was very interesting. They were harmonizing in ways that maybe hadn't been done before exactly that same way,
Right.
but they were influenced by these vocal groups. Not on this album. There's none of that here, but there's a lot of great harmonies for sure.
Yeah, and I think perhaps the best example isn't, as you say, it's a Buddy Holly song, "Words of Love," where John, Paul, and George, although you only hear George had that kind of distinctive, really deep voice. The three of them sing the lead on that together. So I don't know what could have provoked that, that change from not using the material of girl groups or even Motown for that matter. But the results are great.
It was more rockabilly in some cases in this album. You're listening to a new episode of Discos Memorables, or Memorable Records, and we're talking about Beatles for Sale from 1964 by John, Paul, George, and Ringo, the Fab Four from Liverpool. And our guest today is my good friend and colleague, Daniel Nappo from Michigan, and I'm very glad to be talking about this particular album with him, because we seem to share more or less the same ideas or opinions about the album. How much do you think the touring that the Beatles were doing, constant touring, not just playing in Europe, but also in America for the first time, the excitement of that, and then world tour, going to Australia. Ringo actually fell sick at some point during this tour, and Jimmy Nicol, not Pete Best, but Jimmy Nicol was called in to fill in for him.
I bet Pete would have played if they'd asked him.
Well, I'm not sure. He might have, at this point, but definitely his own career hadn't panned out at that point. So there's probably a lot of bitter sentiments, though, in there. The Beatles at this time were touring constantly, and their lives had changed completely. How much of an impact do you think that the constant touring had on the Beatles recording this particular album at the end of that year, 1964?
I suspect it was a huge influence. I really think the year 1964 was one where the Beatles, they had all their creativity, but they had never been more exploited, and they never would be again. I think after 64, and as they got older, they were able to exercise more control of their artistic product. But in this particular year, and at the end of 1963, they were being worked like a Colonel Tom Parker musician. They were doing movies, they were doing constant touring, as you said. This is their second album of the year. This made their fourth album in a little more than a year and a half. It had to have taken its toll.
Radio shows, TV.
Radio shows, TV, and always having to be funny, always having to be bubbly and
witty,
lovable and witty. So I think it took its toll, and I think you see that in the themes of some of the songs, particularly the first three. I think it had a bigger effect on some of the Beatles rather than other ones. Paul, his role in this album to me is really diminished. He comes through with a couple of his own compositions here. I'll Follow the Sun and What You're Doing, I believe, is largely his song.
And
John,
I'll Follow the Sun, wasn't even a song that he had just written, and we
Yeah.
can talk about that later. He had written it several, at least
Yeah.
3 years before.
Yeah.
So, what about John, though?
I think John produced the most and best songs of this album, whether you look at No Reply. Of course, at this period, they were collaborating more wholly, more effectively, so you can't call it simply John's. But I think John probably brought the demo of these songs to Paul, and Paul made some suggestions here and there. I'm sure Rock and Roll Music was also John's suggestion.
Well, he loved Chuck Berry, so.
Yeah, yeah. So I think John came through. For me, this is an album largely, largely the result of the efforts of John and also of George. I think George has a really big album here with his guitar work and also the selection of 2 Carl Perkins songs. He was a huge Carl Perkins fan.
That's right. And he remained so the rest of his life. Even got to play with Carl on record later on, after the Beatles disbanded. But you're right about George. The role of George in this album is interesting because he doesn't really write a song for the album. All the songs are either covers or John or Paul songs, mostly John songs, as you said. But his guitar work is all over the place here, and it actually shows what a very different, versatile, guitarist he was. Because as we said before, these songs are all very different.
Right.
But they all include George's guitar in very specific ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a really good point about George. You may think, well, he doesn't record his own songs here. He had written "Don't Bother Me," for with the Beatles, right? And then he didn't write any songs for A Hard Day's Night. Now, once again, he doesn't have any originals here, but he is very prominent on this album.
He's very prominent. I don't think his guitar work is as prominent on any other album that the Beatles made afterwards. And my point for that is I think this is George in essence on a 6-string electric guitar. I think he's playing a Guild at the time, I'm not sure. But afterwards, of course, he gets the Rickenbacker because he fell in love with the Byrds music so much. And then he gets the sitar. And then in the later albums like Abbey Road, he's playing lead alongside John and Paul. So he's sort of sharing the spotlight as lead guitarist with the other Beatles as well. But George was a really great, underrated guitarist. He had a distinctive sound. He had great taste in the notes that he'd play. He had a great tone in everything he did. That tone, the classic tone of George's to me is Day Tripper. That is George Harrison. Just that little riff at the beginning. And you hear that in several different songs in this album as well. I particularly like the guitar solo on What You're Doing. I think it's beautiful. And my absolute favorite, it's just genius in its simplicity, is I'll Follow the Sun. Just 4 notes. That's it. He just slides up 4 notes. This is the whole guitar solo.
It's a very elegant solo, too.
Very elegant,
so,
minimal.
so subtle.
Yeah. I think that's why George doesn't get a lot of accolades as a great guitarist, because he didn't do anything really flashy. He just did stuff that sounded great.
Also because he is always compared with the other 2.
Yeah.
Obviously not with Ringo, but
Right.
But the truth is, I've always really liked his guitar playing, and whenever he cuts loose in some of those rock and roll numbers, he just embellishes those portions the Beatles do of those songs immensely, but not being flashy, like you said. And I think he is a very controlled guitar player. He had a lot of self-control, I think, when he was creating these solos for the Beatles, and maybe he didn't have as much of that later on in his solo years, but definitely with the Beatles he did. He made some great contributions, definitely.
Later on he started sort of outsourcing some of the guitar work to his friends like Eric Clapton. I think this is one of the things that makes the Beatles such a great band. There were really, with the exception of Paul perhaps, no virtuoso musician among them. They were all just really, really good musicians who played together extremely well. They played within the band. To me, to listen to the Beatles, the things that jump out at me, the most standout sort of things would be just John and Paul's voice above all. And everything else just sort of like puzzles pieces of puzzles that just fit together really nicely.
Well, personally, and I think my dad would agree with this, every time I hear the Beatles, even if it's a sad song, I'm always energized somehow. I always feel happy about hearing them,
Yeah, I
playing
do
the
too.
records. And even if it's a sad song, Babies in Black is a sad song, but it doesn't matter.
Right.
It's still that sort of I don't know. I think they just played so well together, and they just exuded this energy, natural energy. Especially in these days, these
Positive
early
energy,
days.
yeah.
That's for sure. You're listening to a new episode of Discos Memorables, or Memorable Records. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and of course, this podcast will be available on YouTube very soon. And we're talking about Beatles for Sale from 1964 with my friend and colleague Daniel Nappo. Now, let's talk a little bit about the album. You mentioned before that in America, and this is true, Beatles for Sale didn't come out exactly in the same way that it did in Europe and in other parts of the world, because Capitol had this practice of creating different albums with fewer songs so that they could make more albums and sell more. Beatles 65, I think, is the title of one of the albums that had a lot of these songs. The other one is Beatles 6, I think. So they weren't really thinking very much about the titles of those albums. Beatles 65. There was another album, Ellington 65. And there's even a Brazil 65 by Sergio Mendes. So,
I had that album.
it's a good album too, but the thing is, they weren't thinking very seriously about the titles. I feel like the European product is a much more finished, much more, no, I wouldn't say conceptual as a concept album, but the Beatles really were much more involved in the creation of those British/European versions, like Beatles for Sale, right down to the cover. The cover of the album shows the Beatles, I think, in a different way from earlier covers. And the reason for that is they look, to begin with, a lot more serious on this album cover. Now they do on with the Beatles as well,
Right.
with the black and white
black and
silhouettes,
white,
but it somehow feels like the Beatles on this cover are somehow a little bit more grown up than in previous covers. I don't know why, but I've always felt that way when comparing the different covers of this early period. The picture was taken by Robert Freeman, who was a very good and famous at this time photographer, mostly for his work with the Beatles. He took the picture for With the Beatles. He also took the pictures for Hard Day's Night. And then he took the picture here for Beatles for Sale. And I remember, a personal story, that I got a chance to meet Robert Freeman when I was probably about 12 years old, in my hometown. There was some museum had an exhibition of the photographs of Robert Freeman, and he was invited to come to town and, to open the exhibit. And of course, as a huge Beatles fan that I already was at that time, I took my copy of With the Beatles and asked him to sign it for me. And he did. He was a tall man, very British looking, but very kind, very affable. And, he probably couldn't understand why an 11 or 12-year-old would want his autograph. But I definitely did. And really, it was, I have really good memories of that. I probably even have a couple of pictures somewhere. But I really like the cover. What do you think about the cover?
I think it's a great cover too. It does show them more mature. It does show them much more serious, even maybe a little bit disheveled.
That's right.
George's hair, showing the road wear from everything they'd done in '64. It's a very personal cover too. A little bit of color in the foreground. Looks like it could be leaves or something.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of the album you actually got from me recently, the Between the Buttons
Yes.
cover by the Stones. It shows them sort of in their rawest, most unflattering sort of pose out in a park. I guess this was taken in Hyde Park.
Yeah, I'm not sure where, but it was definitely at a park, because there are other pictures from that same session that show the Beatles in a park. So I'm not sure if it was Hyde Park or which one it was, but it was definitely a park, yes.
In so many words, I'm sure they could ask their friend Klaus Voormann to draw something, and it would have been a great cover, but it wouldn't have been the right cover like this one is for this album.
The Rolling Stones album cover, Between the Buttons, has a much more, a much fuzzier
Yeah.
look as well. Because here the fuzzy look is in the foreground, but the Beatles themselves are perfectly in focus, and so we can see that disheveled look, slightly disheveled look that you're talking about, maybe hinting at the fact that they have been overworked and just traveling around the world, going from hotel to hotel to stage to stage, from country to country. So
All the concerts, all the after-concert parties,
that's right.
all the young women
Maybe
pounding on their hotel doors.
maybe
Poor guys.
maybe the alcohol and late night stuff going on. That is for sure. Now, if we look at the other side of the record, we have the songs.
What's your favorite song on this album?
Well, it's a very difficult question because there are a lot of really good ones, but one of my favorites, if I have to choose one, really, I think it would be What You're Doing.
Mm-hmm.
I really like What You're Doing because not only to be original, because nobody knows what you're doing. It would be easier to say No Reply or
Right.
but I really like What You're Doing because of the harmonies and also because of how it changes from the beginning of the song to the middle eight. Also, it has that introduction by Ringo on the drums, which is really one of the few solos that Ringo ever recorded with the Beatles. How about you?
I'd have to say it's a toss-up between I'm a Loser and What You're Doing. I like that song a lot, too. What You're Doing sort of shows me where the Beatles were going with their songwriting. It's an unusually structured song. It's got a little drum solo in it, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
To the extent that Ringo gave drum solos.
That's true. I don't think he had another one until... That's right. That's a pretty good impression right there. I don't think he did another one until the end, that song on Abbey Road. I'm not sure, but I don't remember Ringo doing any other solos with the Beatles.
I don't think he did either. I like I'm a Loser a lot, though, too. I think the lyrics are really good in that particular song. And to hear John, at the top of the world in 1964, come out and sing that, very candid, very introspective. It's a wonderful song.
Much more existential song in that respect.
Right.
Now, we can't play the songs for copyright reasons, of course. We don't want to be thrown in jail for doing this. So, we just, this is what I always say, if anyone's listening out there, you could play the record as, in the background, as, you hear us talk about the songs and, maybe, see what you think, if you agree with what we say or not. And we will go song by song and, talking a little bit about what the songs mean to us, what we think about them, and that sort of thing. Starting with the album opener, which is called No Reply. So No Reply is a song written by John Lennon mostly, apparently. And he based the idea on a previous song called Silhouettes by the Rays, which was a doo-wop group that he liked. At least he liked that song. And he gave him this idea to write a song about a guy that knows the girl is inside the house, but she won't open the door to him. And this is John Lennon,
Right.
A little bit, almost like a stalker in a way.
In a way, yeah. It fits in that tradition of the really jealous guy, which is another, of course, song by John, which Lennon screwed that. The jealous guy who is spying on the woman that he's infatuated with. John does it again with Run for Your Life.
That's right.
As well. He's going to her house, looking at her window.
And it happened once before.
It happened once before.
So, yeah, that's a song that, what do you think about that song as an album opener? Do you think it's a good choice?
I think it's an excellent choice. It's an inspired choice because it's not what the people would expect to hear it. If I were a producer at the time, I would have told them to start the album with 8 days a week. I would have think that song had the most commercial possibilities, but they were more serious artists. I think they wanted to change the mood a little bit. And by the time they come around to the fourth song, Rock and Roll Music, I think they're back to being upbeat and just a great live band.
Okay, a lot of these songs are sort of sad songs too. You know, they're not peppy songs. They might be in the sound of some of them, but and not in every case. But definitely, a lot of the lyrics are pretty much on the sadder side. You know,
Some later examples. I don't want to spoil the party,
that's right.
and also the song we like so much, "What You're Doing." It's clearly expresses some dissatisfaction with a relationship that John is having or Paul is having.
And the second song, "I'm a Loser," is a standout for you, and I would agree with that. And this is where I think John Lennon is beginning to write the kinds of songs that he would write later on. This points towards other songs that he would write later on, and actually not much later. Songs like "Help" or "In My Life," songs that are sort of more existential, more personal. He's trying to bare his soul a little bit as much as he can.
Yeah, you make a really good point. To me, I think the later Beatles song that's the closest relative to "I'm a Loser" is probably "Nowhere Man."
That's right.
I think they sound a lot of like in their tempo, and they're both distinctively John songs. I can't put my finger on what it is about John songs, but there's something in the way he sings them that gives them just this little extra melody within the general melody of it. Whether he's singing "I'm a loser," just something a little bit more in all his songs.
I have the feeling, just to follow up on that, I've always thought that John had more difficulty than Paul McCartney coming up with the melodies. I think melodies came easier to Paul McCartney than they did to John Lennon.
"The Man Who Gave Us Yesterday" and "Hey Jude." I think you're absolutely right.
So I wonder if that has something to do. When you find a Lennon song, it has a very distinctive sort of feel about it.
Right.
Maybe because he had to work more at it. I don't know. Of course, I never met the guy. I have no idea. And I don't think anyone ever asked him about that, as far as I know.
No, it occurred to me, it's not my idea, but I heard that when Harry Nilsson heard for the first time the song that Badfinger did, "Without You,"
That's right.
he thought it was a John Lennon song, because he said it had that Lennon melody in it. And I started thinking about it, and there is something, I don't know if it's just the tone of his voice, or just a little extra melody he puts within the standard melody that anybody else would sing straight, that makes it a John song.
And it's true that he never really liked the sound of his own voice, and so he was always.
I didn't know that. It's
trying
hard to believe.
and that's one of the reasons why he was always trying to distort his voice and use echo and that sort of thing, because he didn't really like his own voice, which is surprising to hear.
It's very surprising.
But John Lennon was in many ways, he was a very odd kind of person, and he had his own, interesting things or strange sides to himself.
What do you think of "Babies in Black"? Do you think that was their attempt to get into that early '60s genre of the boyfriend-girlfriend who die?
It's a good point.
Pop song.
That's song number 3, "Babies in Black," and it's a very odd song, in my opinion. It's one of those songs that, when I finally began understanding English and understanding what the Beatles were singing about in songs, this is one that had always puzzled me greatly. Because this is a song about a man who is unhappy because his girlfriend is still thinking about her dead boyfriend that passed away, and so that is impacting the new relationship very negatively. But it does dabble, in that sort of genre that you're talking about. "Tell Laura I love her," by Ray Peterson.
Where can my baby be?
That's right. But he does it, John Lennon in this case is doing it in a very different way.
Right.
Because it's a very, I wouldn't say complex story, but it does have a little bit of a twist that you don't expect. "Babies in Black." You think about that, and just the title itself is a little strange. And then when you hear the story, it's surprising. But musically, it's a very beautiful waltz. At least most of the time. So it's a song that, to me, it's also a standout among the Beatles originals here, and it's definitely one of my favorites on the album too. It's very hard to pick only one song
Yeah,
out of the 14 here.
It's almost impossible with any of the Beatles albums. I love rock and roll music. I don't think it's quite up to par with Twist and Shout as one of John's greatest rockers, but he certainly gives it everything he's got, especially in the end.
Yeah, that's the fourth song by Chuck Berry, one of the classics of early rock and roll music.
Is that the only Barry song they covered?
No, I think they did Roll Over Beethoven as well,
Oh,
didn't
okay,
they?
yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I wonder if they did any more on their Life of the BBC set or not, but I think they did. They did I Gotta Find My Baby for the BBC. But I think John Lennon really revered the music of Chuck Berry, which, and very rightly so, because, Chuck Berry was one of the main motors of rock and roll in those early years of the mid-1950s. But I agree with you. I don't think that this is the best version of a Chuck Berry song that the Beatles have done. I would call "Roll Over Beethoven" maybe the best of the Berry songs that they attempted. Of course, they always had lots of different Berry songs in their live years before they became famous. But the ones that they recorded, this one is not bad at all. But it doesn't have I guess the energy of the original Chuck Berry rendition of it.
Well, apart from John's voice, what I like is George Martin's piano.
Mm-hmm.
George Martin plays a wonderful rock piano in this.
It's always been interesting to me how much a man that was so far removed originally from rock and roll, how much he understood rock and roll, Sir George Martin. I mean, he's a guy that was doing comedy records before he was producing the Beatles. He was a jazz person, a big band orchestra kind of guy.
He certainly was the right producer for the Beatles.
He definitely was. But I think it is also because he understood the dynamics between the different Beatles, and definitely that piano is great on that. It's one of those songs also, Dan, that it's kind of funny that there was this interest in the early years of rock and roll in writing songs about rock and roll, almost like meta rock and roll songs. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe because these singers felt the need to defend rock and roll from all the different attacks that it had to suffer. I'm not sure.
Rock Around the Clock.
That's a good example. Now, the next song here is a very interesting one. I would like to know your thoughts about Paul McCartney's very beautiful "I'll Follow the Sun."
Well, it's a classic Paul song, and this is a kind of mid-tempo pop song with sort of vague personal lyrics that I think Paul made famous later in his career. To me, this fits in the genre of Here, There, and Everywhere, and so many of Paul's songs. She's Leaving Home, a soft mid-tempo pop song. It's a beautiful song. It's one of my favorite Paul songs. I was really surprised to see that this finishes usually in the top 10 of everybody's favorite Beatles songs.
That's true, and I think lately there has been a couple of polls about that, and they always have those things. And
I love the song, but I was surprised. I wouldn't even put it in the top 20, 25.
it is a very beautiful song, very simple song too. Maybe because it was a song that, as we said before, the Beatles recorded on a demo version in 1960 when they were still the Quarrymen before they became the Beatles. You can find that on YouTube, I'm sure. And it's basically the Beatles, John, Paul, George, and I think Stu Sutcliffe in Paul's parents' house bathroom because the acoustics were better there apparently. Doing some demos of different songs by Gene Vincent and other people, but one of them is an early version of "I'll Follow the Sun," which sounds in that original version a lot like a country and western / rockabilly sort of song, but in this finished version, and I'm sure they took an interest in recording the song because they maybe didn't have a lot of new material, so they they
Paul had
reached
one up
back.
his sleeve. Yeah.
But it's a very different sort of version, a lot more subtle, and just a very dainty little song, I would say.
Well, George's little guitar riff there makes the song, as far as I'm concerned. Not the solo, but just the way he plays, sort of arpeggio, through it, just sort of plucking. It's a great song. It's a really lovely song. Probably the most lovely song on the album. Mr. Moonlight, from I'll Follow the Sun, we go to Mr. Moonlight, which I think is one of the Beatles' worst songs.
Well, they didn't write it, at least.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I can't imagine them writing it. When I listen to it, I have the sense that they didn't think it was a very good song either.
I wonder then, why would they record it? I think they played it live quite a bit in the Hamburg days. It goes back to an older record by somebody called Dr. Feelgood and the Medics. I think it's the person that originally recorded this song, but it's not a well-known song. I don't know of any other versions other than the Beatles, and of course that original one that I mentioned. And I think the Hollies also recorded this song.
Recorded it.
Yeah, I think so. But you don't seem to like the Hammond organ on that song, and I think Paul plays that.
Paul plays it. It sounds all right in the beginning, but I think it just goes way too low for the instrumental, and it sounds like there's almost like a xylophone or something playing as well, and just pairing up that Hammond organ with whatever it is that's playing just doesn't sound good. When the boys sing the chorus and they sing Mr. Moonlight, it almost sounds like they're kind of doing it jokingly, or they're self-conscious of that this isn't their best work.
Could be the kind of song that they just wanted to throw in there to, as filler. Not that there's a lot of filler on Beatles albums, but this might be a good example of that.
Maybe they were told to do 14 songs on the album instead of 13. When you listen to the Beatles as much as we have, you can almost detect little things
like that.
how they feel about the songs, especially from John. Like the noises he makes at the end of Obla Di Obla Da, and
at the end of With and You, Without You, and
right.
Sgt. Pepper's. I think one of the things I don't like about this song, Mr. Moonlight, is, as you said, the fact that the organ is prominent in the song, but it's too low. I think if they had mixed it, a little bit up front, it had sounded a little louder, maybe it would have made the song.
And maybe had a melody for the instrumental going into the studio. It sounds to me like Paul's trying to find a melody. And that's amazing in itself that he couldn't find a melody, that man, but it just doesn't go anywhere as far as I'm concerned.
I wonder how they played it live, though, in those early years, because they wouldn't have had that Hammond organ. I wonder if they would just substitute with guitar or what that would have been. But, it's a song that's in there, and I don't skip it. But I don't skip any of the songs, really. But it's definitely not one of the best in the album, to say the least. Now, the first side of the album, because of course before the days of CDs, you had to get up and flip the LP, the vinyl record.
I remember those days.
Yeah, me too. You see, I'm not that much younger than you are. But in any case, that first side ends with Kansas City / Hey, 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 Hey. What about that song? What do you think?
Well, it's Paul singing one of his great rock vocals.
What a voice.
Yeah, he really has a great voice. A lot of people on the strength of rock and roll music and twist and shout would say that John had the best rock and roll voice. I don't think so. I think Paul had kind of a more soulful rock and roll voice, where John had more of a Kurt Cobain type of screaming type rock and roll voice, which is great on its own. But I just prefer Paul. Paul had a little bit of a almost David Ruffin kind of soulful, husky rock and roll voice.
Yeah, I think he had more of an African-American approach to rock singing, don't you think? I mean, George didn't have that.
No.
He was more of a rockabilly kind of person. But
George sounds like he's singing through his nose in a lot of songs.
But when Ringo was actually singing through his nose, but in the case of Paul McCartney, I think he understood the kind of black rock and roll of the 1950s a lot better than the other Beatles.
I think he did too. I think Paul had the most soul out of anybody in the band, and that's saying a lot, because they all had soul to a great extent. But to me, Paul has right around this time, I think he cut the single with his best rock vocal performance, and that's "She's a Woman." I could listen to that in the way Paul sings that. And
that, in fact, came out before Beatles for Sale. I Feel Fine, back with She's a Woman, that was recorded in advance, and I think came out in advance of this album. And I Feel Fine actually has that strange wah sound that was like a fuzzy guitar, right? Which apparently was some sort of accident that happened in the studio. But you're right. I think She's a Woman is a good example of Paul McCartney trying to write that kind of song. In the same way that John tried to write, a Motown kind of number on "You Can't Do That," for example. I think Paul McCartney on "She's a Woman," which is a very simple song, lyrically and musically, but it's still, it kind of embodies that sort of approach. Now, Kansas City, Hey Hey Hey. Is actually a Little Richard number. Kansas City is not a Little Richard song. Hey 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 is a Little Richard song, and it was Little Richard that actually put the two of them together and recorded them. I think it was the B-side of Good Golly Miss Molly, but I could be wrong about that. In any case, the Beatles toured with Little Richard at some point, and I think that's how they came up with the idea of singing this song, because they heard the great Little Richard, the queen of rock and roll, as he was sometimes referred to, sing this song live. But it's a great way to end this first side of the
It is.
of the album.
It is. It's a great way to end the first side of the album. I always thought, in terms of one of the things that made the Beatles great was a tacit competition between John and Paul. And I like to think, I don't know if it was true or not, but when John would sing rock and roll music, that Paul would want to come back and have his shot at a real
That's
rocker.
right.
And this is his answer to John's rock and roll music.
I think that's a good way to look at it. I think it would happen later on as well, when John Lennon did Larry Williams' "Dizzy Miss Lizzy," for example, to finish the Help album, or to close the Help album.
That's a great song.
I love that. In fact, I just got a compilation. I bought a compilation of Larry Williams' music, and that is I think, one of the most underrated of 1950s rockers in America. I love the music of Larry Williams, and so did the Beatles, particularly John. You're listening to a new episode of the podcast Discos Memorables, or Memorable Records. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and right here to my right is my friend Daniel Nappo, and we're talking about Beatles for Sale from 1964, one of those albums that you don't hear a lot about, but I actually find myself listening to this album a whole lot. Now, let's now flip the record, okay, in the old-fashioned way, and when we put the needle on that B-side, we hear something a little strange.
Yeah, it fades in. The next song is 8 Days a Week, one of their most popular songs, and I think the biggest, most successful single from this particular album. It's a great song. John didn't have many good things to say about it later. I think he said that they were told to come up with something with
Yes.
8 in the title.
Yes.
It's supposed to be the title of a new movie.
Which would later turn out to be a Help. Because I think...
Which has a much better song than 8 Days a Week.
That's true.
It's a title song.
And I think the original title, or working title, was Eight Arms to Hold You, or something like that. But you're right. John Lennon says, and I have it right here somewhere, he said to Playboy magazine that 8 Days a Week was never a good song. We struggled to record it and struggled to make it into a song. It was Paul's initial effort, but I think we both worked on it. I'm not sure, but it was lousy anyway. Now, how can he say that 8 Days a Week was a lousy song?
I'm sure there's a lot of bands that would have loved to have had that song, but the Beatles standards were much higher.
Might be his iconoclastic nature as well. This was a very popular song, and John seemed to sneer at some of the bigger Beatles hits and prefer some more obscure songs. But 8 Days a Week, you mentioned it was a single, but I don't think originally it was going to be, but it became so popular with some of the disc jockeys here in the United States that they had to release it as a single. The single originally was I Feel Fine and She's a Woman, which was something the Beatles did that not a lot of other groups did, which was they released singles that they did not include in albums. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great thing. The Beatles never released an album around a hit single, and that is a good measure of their talent and of the
Magical Mystery Tour didn't have All You Need Is Love.
That's right. Yeah.
For example.
And in fact, Magical Mystery Tour wasn't even an album originally. The Americans made it an album. It was originally an EP, mm-hmm. With the songs from the movie. I think 6 or 7 songs from the movie. And then in America, they thought, well, that's not going to sell, so let's do an LP. And they added a B-side with, All You Need Is Love and Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, Baby You're a Rich Man, so yeah, definitely. I love 8 Days a Week.
I like it too.
I think it's a very happy song, a very jumpy number. And another thing that is interesting is when they say 8 days a week, that's really how much they were working at that time.
Maybe that's why John didn't like it that much.
It could be. As a professor, I'm sure you can sort of understand what they're talking about. We tend to work 8 days a week too.
Seems that way an awful lot.
We don't get paid as much as the Beatles did, though. But Anyway, the next song is definitely one of the songs that I like the best. It's not a Beatles song, but I first heard it by the Beatles, and this is the song that drove me to Buddy Holly. Actually,
Really?
yes, I heard "Words of Love" on this album, and it said underneath Holly, and I thought, who's this Holly? And I'm talking about myself as a 10 or 11-year-old, and so I went out and realized, they were talking about some fellow called Buddy Holly from Lubbock, Texas.
Charles Hardin Holly.
And, this song really made me discover the music of the great Buddy Holly. Words of Love, what a beautiful song.
It is a beautiful song. It's an inspired choice by the Beatles for a cover on this album. I think Buddy Holly was brilliant. I love him. I think he's one of the pillars of early rock and, in fact, bringing country, that sort of element into rock music. I think he was a great songwriter. I think he was an innovative guitarist, but I don't think he was all that great a vocalist. And so when the Beatles give this song their treatment, I think it really blossoms. I think it really sounds like Buddy Holly would have liked to have heard it.
I tend to agree with that because I've always thought that Buddy Holly is a very uncharacteristic rocker. When he does rock, it's not very hard rock. It's rock on the softer side. Not in the way that Pat Boone's rock was soft, but he just has this gentle countryish sound, almost croonerish sound to his style. And in fact, some of his songs could be really Sinatra type numbers, like It Doesn't Matter Anymore, which I think was written by Paul Anka. But anyway, I think Buddy Holly and the Everly Brothers had an incredible amount of influence on the music of the Beatles.
Yeah, definitely. I would have to agree. The Beatles had really good taste when it came to music from the 1950s and early 60s. Buddy Holly, to me, although they're really different, is a little bit like Randy Newman. Great songs, but sometimes they just need that real singer to get in there and perform them.
I've never thought of that. It might be the first time I've ever heard anybody compare those two.
They don't
But
have
you
a
have
lot
a
in
point. You have a point.
I think they both wear glasses.
Well, they were not both from Texas, right?
I think Randy Newman was from Louisiana.
From Louisiana, there you go, that's right. Now, one thing that I know is that Buddy Holly was absolutely enamored of country music, and so he started out with a pal of his called Bob Montgomery as Buddy and Bob, a country duo, and their recordings were very good, but they were stone cold hard country music, like a kind of Hank Williams style, and of course those are not very well known. But big hits like Peggy Sue and Not Fade Away, for example, and many others, they influenced not only the Beatles but also bands like the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones have a great version of Not Fade Away.
Yes, they do. It's one of their classics from their early albums.
Now, the next song was originally recorded not too far from where we're sitting today, about 2 hours down the road, down 45 east south and then 40 west in Memphis, 706 Union Avenue at Sun Records. And it was recorded by one of my favorite Tennessee musicians of all time, out of Jackson, Tennessee, the great Carl Perkins. What do you think about Carl Perkins?
I think he's one of the greatest early influences on rock and roll music. He also had a lot of interesting wigs.
That's true. He was very unlucky too, because when he wrote Blue Suede Shoes, and he was on his way to performing it on national television, I think it was either the Ed Sullivan Show or Milton Berle Show, one of those big shows of the time. He had a car crash and didn't make it to the not taping, but to the live show, because TV was live in those days. And by the time he recovered, Elvis Presley had recorded the song. And of course, Elvis was younger and more handsome, and But one of the things about Carl Perkins that I really love is he was a great songwriter. He wrote great songs like Blue Suede Shoes, of course, Honey Don't. He also did songs like Put Your Cat Clothes On, and his versions of other people's songs like Matchbox or Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. Of course, all of those are songs, almost all of those are songs the Beatles did.
The Beatles covered Matchbox too.
They did too, yeah, for I
with
think for a
the Beatles.
single, or I think it was a single or an EP, or I don't think it's on any album. But besides the fact that he was a great songwriter and he had a very poignant voice, he was also a really good rock and roll guitar player. And I think his playing definitely influenced George Harrison's kind of guitar playing.
Ringo incites George to a really spirited guitar solo on this song.
That's right. It has almost a feeling of being performed live. Almost like it's a live concert, and he's saying, play it one time for me, or play it for Ringo, or something like that. It's something that I don't think they did very often.
No, I don't think so either. I don't think it's something a lot of groups did. To think of John and Paul, the two leaders of the band, I don't think anybody would dispute that. Just stepping back and letting George and Ringo have this particular song, it's really remarkable.
And it's really the kind of song that they did live, over and over and over again in Hamburg and after Hamburg, and they just loved the song. It was a pretty simple song too, like a lot of the Carl Perkins numbers, and it was a very guitar-driven song too. And I think it's definitely one of my favorite songs as far as the covers go on this album. It's a really good cover of Honey Don't. Now after that, we have a song that John and Paul sing together, and it's one of those songs that very often tend to be overlooked in the Beatles canon. You don't hear very much about Every Little Thing. It's still a very pleasant song to my ears. What do you think about that one?
I think it's a great song. I think that it demonstrates how they were just starting to be a little more creative in their arrangements. And I don't mean with the selection of different instruments, but the percussion is unusually loud in this particular song. And a little bit like another song on the album, Babies in Black, where I think George's guitar is really tuned up to make that boom, 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 boom.
Yeah.
They were willing to sort of adjust to make one or two instruments louder than the other ones, and break up the four-piece band sort of arrangement that they'd always played since their Hamburg days. So it's really an interesting song, and it's got a lovely melody as well.
It's also one of those songs that in which the harmonies make the song really, from the very beginning. And it's one of those songs where the Beatles start out with a very beautiful, very interesting melody, and then they switch it for the middle eight, but not too much, just a little bit. And I just love how they were able to do that, and they did it very well in this song.
They were really good showmen. There's so many songs. One of the most prominent examples of what I'm about to describe is Babies in Black. Rock and roll music. They always save something until they get about to the third chorus, where they repeat the chorus for the third time, and then they give you a little bit more. You never listen to the same things over and over with the Beatles in the same song. They had a real sense of showmanship.
Giving the public something extra.
Exactly.
Even in especially in later at later dates, with their later albums. There's a lot of that, little things here or there, but they're already doing this from the very beginning. So I think that's a very good point about this song and about many others on this album and other albums too. Now the next one is a song that sounds very country to me somehow. I don't know what it is about it. It's definitely the guitar or maybe the rhythm of it. It's called I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, and it's another sad song.
It's a very sad song. It was one of the first songs by the Beatles I learned to play on guitar. It's all in G. It's just a few chords.
That's a country song. There you go.
There you go. And it's I don't know what to say about this song. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly strong song, but it's a memorable
It
song.
doesn't make the top 30
No,
possibly.
no, I don't think so.
But it's actually a song that again it's a sad song, but it's one of those songs that when you listen to them, it doesn't make you feel bad.
No, it
somehow.
doesn't. No, it doesn't. It's a jangly guitar. The sounds almost like a bell in some parts. I guess the thing when you think about the other songs in this album that have sort of a serious, disappointed theme, No Reply, I'm a Loser. You have this one, and it just in comparison sounds a little bit staged.
Yes, a little bit because it's a song that the lyrics of the song kind of come across as sort of self-effacing.
Exactly.
I don't want
Yeah.
to spoil the party, so I'll go. Right.
Well, what party could the Beatles have spoiled?
That's
in
true.
December 1964.
Even if they were disappointed, like it says, "I would hate my disappointment to show." It's not even if this disappointment shows, it's not going to spoil the party, right?
When I listen to this song, which is a great song, I feel kind of like when Colonel Tom Parker told Elvis, or told everybody that Elvis recorded his first album for his mama, that kind of thing. So people would have some sort of empathy and, oh, let's cuddle the Beatles. The poor Beatles don't want to spoil our party.
And they're for sale for Christmas, so
Millions of legions of teenage girls want to comfort them because they don't want to go to their party.
Yeah, I have heard stories though about John Lennon in the early days being kind of aggressive and spoiling some parties. I think there's this very famous altercation with a DJ in Liverpool called Bob Wooler that Billy J. Kramer talks about, and he just became enraged by something and he spoiled the party. But I don't think he was thinking about this here.
No.
I think as you were saying,
This isn't autobiographical.
it's not autobiographical. It's not in my life, no. But it definitely gives you an idea that the Beatles could also put on a show and just write a song. You don't have to feel a certain way to write a good song. You don't need to feel like a motherless child to write Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. You could be putting on a show, right? And I think they're doing that here. That's a good point too. Now we've talked about What You're Doing a little bit. And I've always loved that song. I name it as my favorite in this album. I love the melody of the song. I love the way that the Beatles come together for the song, how it starts in a very unexpected way, because up to this point, Ringo had not done any sort of drum introduction to any of the songs, at least not on record. And I think this is, to me, one of the highlights of the album. One of those songs that you don't hear much about. It's not going to make any top 10 or 20 or maybe even 100, but it's one of these songs that I just love to hear every time it comes on rotation on my iPod, or or when I'm listening to this album, I stop and listen to this one in particular for some reason.
I feel exactly the same way you do about it. I think Paul sounds really good on this particular song too. It's a very interesting melody, kind of an unconventional melody in some ways that they become more and more famous for as time would go on.
It's one of the Paul's solo vocals on this album, which, as you mentioned before, was more of a John album overall. But Paul McCartney has a very interesting contribution to the album here, and it's surprising that being such a John Lennon-centered album, my favorite song turns out to be a Paul McCartney solo vocal.
I'm kind of surprised it gets lodged way at the end of the album. I would have thought they could have broken up maybe the first 3 or 4 with that, since it's the same kind of theme in some ways as the first 3 songs.
It was sort of a running theme that kind of came up and then disappeared and then came back up
It's a
again at the
concept
end.
album.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but you know that I don't believe that Sgt. Pepper's is a concept album either, at least not in the classic
It's just
sense of the
bookended
word.
by,
So, the idea of concept albums, whenever I think of concept albums, I think more about Frank Sinatra in the 1950s, and then, of course, the classic concept albums of the 70s, like Dark Side of the Moon. And, But, of course, the Beatles definitely did a lot for the concept album to be talked about again when they did Sgt. Pepper's, even though I really don't believe that it's a concept album. Maybe one day we can talk about Sgt. Pepper's and we can go deeper into
I'd
that.
enjoy that.
How about the final song? We get to number 14, so the seventh song on the B side of Beatles for Sale, the Closer, is a song that George sings in this case. And it's another one of those Carl Perkins songs. Everybody's trying to be my baby. What a title.
Yeah, and it's a great song. I think John and Paul wanted to give George his chance and give him a song to do, and I'm sure George, being a big fan of Carl Perkins, just decided he'd cover this song. It's got some of the most memorable lyrics.
Took some honey from a tree, dressed it up.
And they called it me.
You know, the interesting thing about this song is it's credited to Carl Perkins, and he definitely made a great record of it at 706 Union. It's on
Didn't
records.
he take it from somebody else?
But he did take it from somebody else.
I guess that makes up for Blue Suede Shoes.
There's earlier versions of this song. I remember a version of it by Rex Griffin, who was a country singer from the 1930s. Just guitar and Rex Griffin singing. It's a really different version, but it's still the same song. The lyrics are pretty much the same. But Carl Perkins rocked it up and made it into, you know, a classic rockabilly number. And I guess George Harrison, being the big Perkins fan that he was, he dug deep into the catalog of Carl Perkins and found this song. I must admit that it doesn't happen to me with Honey Don't, but in the case of Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, the Beatles version is the first one that comes to mind, and not the Carl Perkins version when I hear about this song. Now, in the case of Honey Don't, it's Carl Perkins.
It's the other way around.
It's the other way around, yes. But for some reason, this version that the Beatles do is really powerful. It's really well done, and I think it speaks a lot to their personal lives at that time.
I do too. In fact, and looking at the other 13 songs in the album, No Reply, I'm a Loser, I Don't Want to Spoil the Party, this is probably the most sincere statement of what they were living at
And
the
they
time.
didn't write it.
That's exactly right. Everybody wanted to be their baby in December 1964.
And many got to be their baby at that, you know. Although their steady girlfriends or wives wouldn't be happy to hear about that. But it's true. It's a song that they also did live very often during their tours. And it's a song they really enjoyed to sing. And
I like George's voice. I enjoy listening to him sing. It's nasally, as I said before, but it's just George, you know, and to know the guy and know what kind of person he was and what a mensch he was, to hear him sing a song and having fun with it. I mean, you can almost hear him smiling when he sings this song.
that's true. And I think he knows, when he's singing this song, that people will understand what he's talking about, because this is really the year of Beatlemania,
Right.
and this is the album that basically bookends that huge year of Beatlemania. Nothing would be the same in the history of the Beatles, and some would say, rock and roll pop music after this year of 1964. The Beatles would change quite a bit, but I think, as we said, to kind of come full circle to the beginning of our conversation, this album points in that direction already in many ways. We've been going through song by song, and I think we can see that there are songs here that really lead us to things that are, or kind of foreshaddle things that are to come in their career.
Well, absolutely, it fits very well in their trajectory and in their canon, and to a credit to them. I mean, at the end of this difficult year, and all the things they had to do, all the responsibilities that they had, they still could walk in the studio and make a superlative album, and be creative and not just slap something together and send it out.
And especially bearing in mind that they didn't have a lot of
let's face it, the
originals.
Beatles could have made a much worse album. They could have done an album of entire covers. They could have done strictly Christmas songs, and it would have sold millions of copies at this point.
And that's something they never did. They never tried to tap into the Christmas
They
market.
showed a lot of artistic integrity, and the way they democratically do things in the Beatles, and especially in the beginning, let Ringo have his opportunity. George has his. When one of them doesn't sing a lot of songs, the other one steps up. What you see with Paul and John. I mean, they were such a tight band in so many ways. Just the four of them. I don't know of another band where all four members have such a prominent role.
Why do you think that so many critics have been so critical of this album? Like you have this book on the table right there in front of you by Mark Hertsgaard, A Day in the Life, and Mr. Hertsgaard is not very happy with this album. He says it's one of the least artistically interesting albums by the Beatles or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. But why do you think the critics that are looking back at the career of the Beatles are so critical of this 1964 Beatles for Sale?
Well, I think the Beatles are a victim of their own success. I think they had such quality albums early on. And arguably, the third album they had, the one immediately before this one, A Hard Day's Night, had been their best album. It was all, if I'm not mistaken, original songs.
Yes, no, not a single cover in that one, yeah.
And lots of hits, just a terrific album. And so this one just sort of seems, just a little less than what they're used to doing. Here's a band that had arguably the greatest debut album of all time, no sophomore slump. Their third album was outstanding and paired with a wonderful movie that everybody's critically acclaimed. And then they come out with this album with the sort of, ironic title Beatles for Sale.
Almost very commercial.
They could have called it Beatles Sell Out.
But do you think it's a commercial album, though?
I do. I think it's a commercial album, but they put enough grist in there to make it much more serious, more than just a commercial. More than just commercial appeal. For the true Beatle fan, there's a lot in there to like.
There's a lot,
and they got new fans with this album too.
One thing that is interesting about the Beatles, it makes me compare them sometimes as a group with the old big bands. Not musically, of course, necessarily, but the fact that they played together so much, like those old big bands, that were just doing one-nighters all over the place throughout America, that when they got into the studio, they could really record great things in no time. Now the Beatles quit doing that. They started, coming to the studio with just ideas and then working in the studio. But that first album, Please Please Me, is a good example of how they could record a great album in one day.
Yeah, it's like they stepped off the stage in Hamburg and just walked into a studio and played.
And if you think about, how long it takes some current musicians to record one album, or even, from the 70s on, it's incredible that the Beatles recorded so many albums between 1962 and 1970. It's incredible.
Today they have to program the background music, and then they do the vocals, and then they auto-tune it. I mean, there's a lot for them to do today.
That's for sure. Well, this is a memorable album for my friend Dan Nappo. I'll give you the last word, Dan. If you had to encourage somebody out there who has never heard Beatles for Sale, maybe they've heard other songs by the Beatles, the typical Yesterday or Hey Jude or Let It Be or something like that. Why did I choose 3 Paul songs right there? I don't know. Strawberry Fields Forever. Okay.
There we go.
What would you say? How would you describe this album to somebody out there? How would you encourage them to go find this album, which you could find any place really, online or at Walmart or whatever you want? Why this album in particular?
Well, I think it's arguably the great lost Beatles album. I think it gets lost in consideration of their many terrific albums, and I think you see the direction the band's going with this. It's an important album for them, and the songs are great. Also, the covers are a lot of fun too. They bring themselves and put themselves into these covers and make just about every one of them better than the original. So I think it's a terrific album all the way around.
I totally agree with that, and I would definitely encourage everyone out there, whether they know the album or not, if you don't know it, look for it, because I think you're going to like it. If you already know it, just listen to it again, because it's an album that we sometimes tend to forget, and it's good to rediscover, even Beatles fans,
But one other thing I might add, you hear what a great group of musicians the Beatles were too. The musicianship, standard musicianship, bass, guitar, drums, rhythm guitar, forefront. This is before a lot of studio experimentation, where much of that gets lost, unfortunately. You can still hear John playing harmonica. All these wonderful things that you don't hear that much on the later albums. So I think it's a great album for the Beatles.
Also at a time when they were touring all over the world and they couldn't hear themselves play. So it's interesting that they actually get back to the studio and they have a little moment of, I wouldn't say quiet, but at least some time to actually explore different artistic avenues without
that's a
all those
wonderful point.
screaming fans that
Yeah.
wouldn't allow them to hear themselves play. So I think that's a very interesting thing, and there's many reasons to like Beatles for Sale. Well, Dan, I really appreciate
This is a lot of fun,
your
Anton.
being
I'd
here
like to
and,
do it again.
and chatting about this
great.
album. We should do it again with some other album by the Beatles or somebody
You
else.
choose the next album y lo haremos en español.
Eso me parece una muy buena idea. Let's check on that.
Muchas gracias. Thank
This
you.
has been a new episode, number 8, of Discos Memorables, or Memorable Records, recorded live in Martin, Tennessee, United States of America. The copyright is for Anton Garcia Fernandez, 2017. Muchas gracias, Dan. Hasta la próxima.
Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima.